We are very pleased to welcome Daniel Mays to discuss no-till vegetable gardening for the home grower this evening. Daniel is the owner and farm manager of Frith Farm, a no-till organic farm located on 14 acres at 61 Ash Swamp Road in Scarborough. Daniel purchased the farm and homestead in 2010 and now grows organic vegetables, herbs, flowers, and perennial crops, in addition to offering educational workshops and community events. The farm offers a CSA, Consumer-Supported Agriculture Shares, and last year served 150 families, and also sells its produce at Lois's Natural Foods in Scarborough, the Portland Food Co-op, and New Morning Natural Foods in Kennebunk, and also sells food during the summer and fall at Scarborough Farmers Market. They are now taking registrations for next year's CSA program on the farm's website, frithfarm.net. Daniel grew up in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and early on developed a respect for nature and the environment. During a varied career in education, which included a master's degree in environmental engineering, he volunteered on a number of farms, but was by no means a farming expert when he bought was to become Frith Farm. Through trial and error, building on the work of other farmers, and with the help of neighbors, family, and friends, Daniel has built a successful enterprise, selling $300,000 of food each year and employing a full-time seasonal crew of 9 people. Daniel is the author of the No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm, How to Start and Run a Profitable Market Garden that Builds Health in Soil, Crops, and Communities, recently published by Story Publishing. He describes his book as a how-to manual for intensive no-till vegetable production on a commercial scale and a treatise on the importance of a holistic approach to agriculture and to life on a shared planet. Tonight, he will share how we can apply or modify the principles and practices described in his book to our own smaller home gardens. Please help me virtually. We know you're all helping me. Welcome Daniel Mays to the library this evening. Hi, Daniel.
Hello, thank you. Very wonderful, generous introduction. Thank you. Very happy to be talking to you all virtually. Yeah, it's hard to not see everyone's face and read your response, but I'll trust that you're all there in spirit. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how we grow vegetables, how we treat the soil, how we generate soil health. And I am a commercial farmer. We grow on 3 acres very intensively, churning out a lot of foods, but I think a lot of the principles do apply to a smaller scale. But I haven't tried to go through and, pretend to know exactly how you all garden. So I'm sticking with what we do, and I'll leave it to you to transfer that to what makes sense in your own yard. So yeah, without further ado, I will jump into the presentation. And as has been said, please, if you have questions as we go along, which I hope you do, please put them in the chat. And if they are urgent, then the host will interrupt me and ask them. Otherwise, we'll just save them till the end and have hopefully plenty of time for questions at the end. So yeah, starting out here, see if I can share my screen. Here we go. So yeah, this is no-till vegetable production. This is a presentation I also gave at the Common Ground Fair. Modified it just a little bit. So my apologies if you watched that already, but hopefully, it's a little different every time. And this one is, yeah, a little bit more geared to the smaller scale home garden. But really what, how we farm here is basically like a home, like 10 home gardens squished into one. So it's, we don't use a lot of mechanization. We do most work by hand. but we do have a bigger group of people working the land. We have 9 full-time employees. So yeah, jumping in, before I start talking about our specific practices, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is Wabanaki land. It's maybe hopefully this doesn't feel too uncomfortable for people, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that farming and homesteading, the history of agriculture and growing food, post Columbus on this continent is wrought with land theft and slavery. So acknowledging that, I think, is really important as we look toward healing the ecological landscape, toward healing the land from environmental issues. I think those are inherently related to the history of the land and the trauma that's been sort of inflicted on the land. So yeah, that's a whole nother topic, but I at least wanted to acknowledge it here. So you can go to this website, nativeland.ca, and that can actually show you which native nations and confederacies, land you're on. So here we are in Wabanaki land here in what's called Maine now. So zooming in onto this particular property where I am right now, this is 61 Ash Swamp Road. When I bought the land 10 years ago, these pictures show it here. The house was in pretty serious disrepair. Some might have said it was worth tearing down, but it had a lot of history. It's a 200-year-old house. So I saved it and renovated it. And then the fields here, it's just a big open hayfield when I got it. So yeah, sort of a clean canvas for starting a farm. And so I did just that. And here we are. This was taken last year, the same property. The house is, fully restored by now. We've renovated the barn as well. We've built another, timber frame structure in the same, style from 200 years ago. And put up a number of greenhouses and established a whole series of permanent raised beds for growing vegetables, and that's what I'll be talking a lot about today. But I just wanted to give you an overview of the farm so you know the context I'm talking about. We grow on 3 acres of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. We employ 9 full-time employees from April through November. And we sell, as was said, we sell through natural food stores, CSA, farmers market, and a small on-farm store. So this might look, very grand and big compared to your home garden, but I think a lot of our practices do scale down and can be, implemented at pretty much any scale. So talking about soil health, what is soil health? How do we generate health in the soil? Because that ultimately, I think, is the goal of farming, is turning soil and sun into food that sustains us, nourishes us. So how do we create the healthiest soil possible so that in turn our food is as healthy as possible, and therefore we are as healthy as possible? As terrestrial organisms ourselves, we are part of the soil food web. So we are only as healthy as the soil that we're eating from. So what is nature's model for generating soil health? It's there's sort of 4 principles I see when I look to sort of natural wild spaces that haven't been just overly farmed or managed, and those I will get into here. So the first is to we don't see a lot of soil disturbance, hence the term no-till is really trying to get at that. Nature doesn't continually, send fast-moving metal through the soil profile. That really only happens after a pretty serious natural disaster, like a hurricane or a landslide, earthquake. So certainly not multiple times in a season. So yeah, these are principles that we can emulate, on our farms or in our gardens. Number 2, in natural settings, the soil is pretty fully covered. You don't really see it in a healthy ecosystem. Even under, in the woods where there's no light, not enough light to grow, understory plants, you don't see the soil, you see a thick layer of duff or mulch, Always, so the soil is kind of like the, it's the underbelly, it's the organs of the earth. So we don't want to just like continually expose those to the air and to the sun. And then, the third principle would be just prolific diversity. You look to a healthy ecosystem, you really never see just one species of plant growing, across an entire field. That's a pretty artificial setup. And that diversity, has all sorts of benefits to the resiliency of that ecosystem. There's so many symbioses that come into play with multiple species, multiple different animals, insects, all living together in the soil. And all of this, a healthy soil ecosystem is really driven by photosynthesis. And that's something I really want to stress in this slideshow. I think it's often absent from farming and gardening discussions, is that photosynthesis is the only way to generate soil. That's how all of our soils were created. And there's no other way to literally build soil. We can import compost. Well, that's just photosynthesized material from somewhere else that we're importing. So it had to have photosynthesized originally. Keeping our soils covered with living plants as much as possible is really like the best way we can generate soil health. So with those sort of natural principles of soil health in mind, we can kind of look at our farming systems that really try to farm by those. So we have permanent no-till beds here. So we do till once to break the sod. Disclaimer, we're not completely purist there. To go from sod to garden beds, we do till once. But then after that, we don't disturb the soil anymore. So they're permanent beds. And then we cover them fully with mulches at all times. So on the beds, here in this picture, we have compost as a mulch. And then in the paths, we have leaves that are just, from local deciduous trees. The compost is a great mulch on top of beds because you can plant right into it. You can plant right through it, as opposed to the leaves are a little harder to plant into. So we put those in the paths where we walk. The leaves take longer to break down, so those paths remain weed free for longer. The mantra really is never see the soil. And using compost as mulch like this and leaves or wood chips in the paths, we can really hold to that. Even as we harvest a crop and plant the next one, we can make sure no soil is ever showing. And when we do that, there's all sorts of benefits to that. That mulch on top of the soil functions to retain moisture in the soil. Water is the foundation of life. So if the soil dries out, that's really not good for it. So this, it holds the moisture in, it keeps the sun off the soil, so it regulates the temperature in the soil. And it also is it's food and habitat for all sorts of microorganisms that can, break down those carbonaceous materials. There's so many benefits to organic matter in the soil, and in this case on the soil, to protect it. So here's our planting of tomatoes with basil along the shoulders of the beds. I promise there's a path down the middle there. You can't really see it, but so this is just to show again the importance of photosynthesis diversity. There's no soil showing here. There's really maximum photosynthesis happening, feeding the soil, and the diversity of more than one species growing at once is also good for the soil. Just to stress the photosynthesis again, if you remember from high school biology class, photosynthesis takes the sun and takes carbon dioxide out of the air and turns that into soluble carbon. So carbohydrates, proteins, sugars, and it pumps those down through the roots of the plant and exudes them out into the soil. So it's literally taking carbon out of the air and pumping it into the soil. I don't know if that rings any bells for you, but that's sort of the solution to our climate challenges, is that mechanism right there of taking the carbon out of the air, putting it into the soil. In the soil, that carbon becomes life-giving instead of in the atmosphere where it's life-threatening. So again, another reason to just keep as much living growth on your soils at all times as possible. Here's another example of a cover crop we grew of sorghum Sudan grass. That's 8 feet tall, and here's a beneficial pollinator bed we have planted alongside them with goldenrod and bee balm, and I think there's some baby's breath in there. But just trying to mimic nature's model of diversity and just prolific abundance of photosynthesis. To capture as much sun as possible and as much carbon as possible and put it in the soil. So yeah, that's sort of the principles. Now let's get down to the brass tacks of how we actually do, establish beds. This is, like I said, we do till once to go from sod to beds, and this is we use a little walk behind, it's called a walk behind tractor. A BCS is the brand. I'm not sure what that stands for, but yeah, it's an Italian brand, and it's basically a glorified rototiller, except that it has, you can switch out different implements onto it. So we don't use the rototiller implement, we use what's called a rotary plow, which kind of kicks the soil to the side, and you can see here that it forms those raised beds by doing so. So I think this is equipment that you can rent locally. I'm not positive about that since we own one. I've never tried to, but I imagine this is something you can rent to build your own gardens. So yeah, we start by tilling, forming these raised beds with this little machine. Not shown is that we spread compost and soil amendments before tilling. And, I could talk all day about soil amendments, but basically I recommend getting a soil test. You can do that through the University of Maine for $18. You send it off in the mail and they send you back a little description of the chemical analysis of your soil. You can see what minerals are deficient, and you can purchase those sort of natural rock powders or natural fertilizers and apply them to the land before you till. Since this is the last time we're tilling, it's also the last opportunity to mechanically mix those amendments into the soil. So I do recommend doing that as you form your permanent beds. Then, yeah, the step 2 is we tarp the whole area that we tilled. So again, this is, probably looks like a very big area to home gardeners, but you could do this on your 4 foot by 8 foot plot if you wanted to. You just need a smaller tarp. And this is to smother the weeds. Since we tilled up that sod, tilling sod doesn't kill it. It just stirs it up and then it'll sort of reroot and regrow. So you can't just till it and plant into it. You have to till it and then somehow kill those perennial weeds, the grasses and dandelions and other weeds in the soil. Sometimes people will just keep tilling it over and over again, and eventually that will kill the sod, but it will also kill just a lot of other things that you don't necessarily want to kill, earthworms and critters in the soil. So tarping it is a much lower, lower impact way of killing just those perennial roots. Without over tilling the soil. So we tarp it usually if there's perennial roots like quackgrass or just real established sod. It might take a couple months to smother it. So this is something to sort of plan ahead for. If you do this in the spring, maybe you're not going to plant until midsummer for these new beds. So yeah, if you can plan ahead and do it the year before you actually want to plant, even better. So it does take a little bit of forethought. You can't just go out and spray Roundup and kill everything right away. But then after that tarp comes off, usually, yeah, maybe 6 weeks or so in the early summer. All that sod is dead. All the weed seed in the top, half inch has either, germinated or been just kind of cooked by the hot tarps, because they're black tarps. They heat up in the sun. So there's very little weed pressure after that. And then to reduce that weed pressure even more, we spread a layer of compost on top, also to protect the soil as soil coverage. And we mulch the paths with, in this case, it was wood chips, but you could use leaves or straw, whatever you have. And then we rake that out and plant right into it. And you could plant a cash crop into that. You could plant your vegetables or whatever you want to grow, but to generate soil health even more, we plant a cover crop. So we plant what gets called a cocktail, a mix of different cover crops, but all of them will die back in the cold of winter. So we pick those species of cover crop carefully to ensure that they will die back naturally in the cold of a Maine winter. That's sometimes called winter kill. They will all winter kill. So we seed those. We irrigate them as needed to make sure they germinate well. At a home scale, that might just mean, watering them by hand, because you want to make sure that soil doesn't dry out usually takes about 4 or 5 days to germinate, maybe up to a week. So keep them watered, and then, once they're established, they need much less water. And they should be, pretty entirely weed free because of the tarping, and then because of the mulches on top as a weed barrier. So it's this form of no-till farming is really low weed pressure farming. I think weeds tend to be what get the better of a lot of organic farmers, and also just sort of demoralize home gardeners. So this is really a great way. You're always going to have some weeds. You can't get away from weeding, but this is a great way to really reduce that pressure. This is that same plot later in the fall, and it's probably 4 or 5 feet tall at this point. Just prolific diversity. I think there's 5 or 6 species in that mix of cover crop, and also just look at all that photosynthesis. We're really pumping a lot of health into the soil with that cover crop, and then to add even more diversity, if you have any, chickens at home or anything, you could run them over the cover crop. You could, put a fence around it, or just let them run on top of that, and they will just have a ball. We ran our turkeys over the cover crop back when we had turkeys, and they would, graze it and have a party in there and add all their manure, which is great, biological diversity for the soil. And then remember, all these species were picked carefully to die back in the cold of winter, so that they die. And in the spring, I don't have pictures of the rest of this, unfortunately, but in the spring, basically, it just looks like straw on the soil, and we can just rake that off into the paths and plant right into those beds.
Daniel, we did have a question, maybe it fits in here. Someone's asking, let's see here. Do you recommend a greenhouse, in quotes, covering for raised beds in backyards for longer growing seasons? And if so, should you remove them in winter?
Yeah, I think it depends on the crops. Certainly crops like tomatoes or peppers will love will love that extra heat. Or if you want to grow into the shoulder seasons with salad greens, later into the fall, early winter, or earlier in the spring. So yeah, greenhouses are definitely beneficial. They're not necessary though. You don't need them to grow, pretty much any kind of vegetable here in Maine. But they can be very helpful too. If you have a lot of rain, they can keep the rain off of your vegetables, and you can just regulate temperature better. Warm up the soil faster in the spring. That gets at that. But yeah, there's no one size fits all for growing food. So whatever works for you and what you want to grow and your particular location, Yeah.
We have another question, which you could either take now or maybe you want to wait till later, but it's from Kelly, and she says, why doesn't the nutrient-rich compost encourage weeds to grow? I am not understanding why compost on the top of no-till provides weeds to be suppressed.
Thank you. Yes. I think yeah, please. Yeah, great question. I often just go too fast, especially I'm used to a farming audience too. So, so yeah, compost, assuming it is good compost that is weed free, there's no weed seed in the compost itself. Compost is, can act as a mulch. So it's, weeds in the top of your soil, they need to be within a half-inch or so of the soil surface in order to germinate and be able to poke up into the light and grow. So if you put an inch of compost that doesn't have any weed seeds in it, if you put that on top of the soil, even if there are weed seeds down in the soil, they're not going to grow up through that inch of compost mulch. So that's how it acts as a weed barrier, and prevents the weeds from even germinating. Hope that makes more sense. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. All right, I'll carry on here. So yeah, once beds are maintained, that's what I just went through. Those steps are sort of our ideal steps for forming new beds. And once they're formed, this is how we maintain them. It can be as simple as just giving it a light rake and planting the next crop. So these two beds on the right were just seeded to carrots. We use I think I have a picture of it later. We use a little walk behind push seeder called an earthway. But you could certainly just, make a little furrow and seed with your hand if you're just doing, 10 feet at a time. But we seeded those to carrots, and right before that, like a day before this, those beds had lettuce heads in them. So we just harvested the lettuce heads by cutting them right at the soil surface, give it a little quick rake after that, and plant the carrot seeds right over where the lettuce heads were. There's no need to go rototilling it up, or disturbing that soil at all. In fact, all those root systems of the lettuce heads end up feeding the soil really nicely, if we just let those stay intact without churning it up. Also, without churning it up, all the weed seeds that are buried deep in the soil don't get turned up, to get within that half-inch of the surface that they would need to germinate. So again, it's just greatly reduced weed pressure by not disturbing the soil. So yeah, maintaining these no-till beds can be as simple as just, you pull out one crop and put in the next. And maybe you're used to that at home with your, raised bed gardens. There's not, that doesn't require a huge amount of maintenance between crops, if the soil is kept covered. If the soil is not kept covered and you get a hard rain, you might notice it really compacts, and then you might need to, fork it or something to loosen it up again. So another reason to keep that soil coverage intact. So another thing we do, after kale or something that leaves a lot of residues, has, a lot of stalks left over, we'll use our same little walk behind tractor here with a flail mower on it. So this is just not something you might do at home, I guess, but it's just like a little chipper shredder on wheels almost, and it just chops up all that material and leaves it right on the surface. So at home, you could do this with, as simple as like loppers or something. You could just chop down those stalks and leave them right there, or take them off and put them in the compost, and then you'll have more compost to apply later to the soil. But again, leaving those root systems intact, so that they can keep feeding the soil for future crops as they break down. And then after we flail mow, we might tarp that area just to make sure the root systems are dead of those previous crops. Because otherwise, a kale plant, if you cut off the top, it might regrow from the roots. And then you have a sort of funky, misshapen kale plant that's growing up amid your next crop. So we don't want that. So we tarp again using tarps as a low disturbance way to kill the roots that we don't want in the soil. And that might be just a couple days if it's hot and sunny, or, you know, a week and a half if it's cooler and cloudy. And then we plant right through, you know, we pull that tarp off and plant right through the residues. You know, you don't need a perfectly churned up fluffy bed of soil to plant into. So you can see here in this picture, we've seeded the spinach right between the stubble left from the, I think that was arugula before the spinach. So this is much more, you know, mimicking a natural system where, you know, new growth rises up through the decaying layers of previous growth. It's not sort of a, you don't wipe the slate clean with you know, churning up the soil between successions of plants. And then as soon as soil starts to show, you know, if we notice a lot of weeds growing, that's a sign that the soil is getting close to the surface again. Then we'll add more compost as a mulch before we plant the next crop. So again, this is weed free. This is organic compost. If compost is labeled as organic, that means it's gone through a pretty rigorous process of heating up, getting up to 140 degrees, I think it is, multiple times in a row as they keep turning it. And that pretty much guarantees it shouldn't have a lot of weed seed in it. So using weed-free compost as the mulch keeps, you know, acts as a weed barrier and protects the soil. And then planting into that is just, is pretty much a dream. Like it's almost like brownie batter. You just poke your transplants right into that, your seedlings. And then there's very little weed pressure. Like I've said, there's no soil showing, there's no way for the weeds to grow because they're all buried under this mulch. And then in the winter, before snow flies, we try to mulch the beds with leaves or something more enduring than compost, since, you know, winter is pretty harsh on where we are and on the soil. You know, a lot of rain, a lot of snow, a lot of, you know, melt off. So we want to give that soil a bigger layer of protection for the winter. So we use leaves or straw or bark mulch, something more enduring than just compost, because the compost might wash away in the winter a little bit. And then the following spring, we just rake that leaf matter or whatever mulch we use, we just rake it into the paths and plant right into those beds. And, you know, because of that mulch, the soil underneath is just crumbly and rich and soft. You know, there's earthworm castings throughout. It's just ready for planting with, you know, it's mimicked what a tiller might make it look like, but it's all biological instead of mechanical. We'll call that, like, it's biologically tilthed and prepared for us by the earthworms. We just plant right into it in the spring. Yeah, so I guess I'll jump into cover cropping. This is, you know, avoiding tillage and keeping the soil covered are sort of the basic steps, but then we can add cover cropping and really pump health down into the soil through photosynthesis. So I'll try and keep it simple. There's sort of two scenarios. For those of you who are new to cover cropping, peas and oats are sort of one of the easier things to do. So I'd recommend, if you've never cover cropped before in your garden, maybe try peas and oats either in the spring or in the fall. Then if you get more, so peas and oats go where next year's early spring crops are going. Like if you're planting them in the fall, you can plant them anywhere you want to plant really early the next year, because peas and oats will winter kill. So they will die back in the cold of winter very reliably in our climate. So they're a great option for, you know, before your spring onions or your early spring greens. You can plant peas and oats the fall before. Or if you get more adventuresome, you can try winter rye. You can mix it with anything really, but crimson clover is a nice combination. But winter rye will overwinter. It survives the winter and will regrow vigorously in the spring. which is great for the soil health, but not so great if you want to plant anything else there in the spring. So don't try and do that. But plant that in beds that won't be planted until later, sort of, you know, mid-June or later. It's great for that because I'll go through how we can actually knock it down and kill it in early June, and then plant right through that as a mulch. So these are two scenarios of cover cropping that I'll go through pretty quickly with pictures how we do it. And I think if I were, you know, growing at a home scale, I'd be very excited to try this, you know, very tiny scale. I think it really is applicable. So here are peas and oats. That's what they, you know, a mature stand of peas and oats looks like. This was grown in the spring. You can grow them in the spring or the fall. In the spring, you can plant them as soon as the snow melts. So I think these were planted mid-April. And then in the fall, to get a good stand, you have to plant them by the end of August, ideally. So September 1st is sort of the goal planting date, which, you know, you have to fit that in with your crop plan of you know, do you have that, are those beds empty when they need to be, to get a good planting of peas and oats in. So this is what a good stand looks like. And then what we do with that is, well, we used to flail mow it, like I was talking about with the flail mower, and you can see that first bed on the right has been all chopped up. And that works fine, but what if you don't have a flail mower? Well, this is an innovation that some of my crew came up with. I think this will work. This is sometimes we call this rolling the cover crop. So that's yeah, that's just to knock it down before we pull tarps onto it. You can roll it like that if you want to have some fun, but you can also just sort of stomp it down with your feet, or sometimes we put a T-post, attach a T-post to our boots and stomp that down on the side to sort of, yeah, knock it down. Because then we drag a tarp over that to make sure it's killed. Again, tarps are a great way to sort of kill something you don't want without having to churn up the soil. And then when that tarp pulls off, this is that same stand of peas and oats. It now looks like a nice straw. It's all dried out and killed, and we can just rake it into the path to expose our beds for planting. So here's those same beds with the yeah, peas and oats raked into the paths. The beds are planted. I think they're to turnips or storage radishes here, daikon radishes, but you could plant them to anything you want at that point. Here are the radishes growing. There they are, ready for harvest. And again, very, very little weeding because those peas and oats were seeded into compost. So there's no exposed soil, and then we didn't disturb the soil at all planting the next crop, so it's very little weed pressure. So I really like this method because it's a great way to feed the soil. You know, we didn't add any fertilizer to this. The peas and oats were the fertilizer, and then, you know, there's no machines, no inputs really besides seed and just some human labor. So it's really, it feels like a nice biological method for growing healthy food. So similarly, here's winter rye and crimson clover. Winter rye is one of the most vigorous of cover crops. It's a winter annual, so it survives the winter and then goes to seed the next spring. So usually toward the end of May, early June is when that's when this picture was taken, around June 1st. And at that point, we will knock it down. Well, I guess first, this is how we seed it. So this is in the fall. Winter rye can be seeded much later than peas and oats, so all the way up to October 1st. So that's a real benefit. It grows really well in the cold. So if you still have crops in the ground in September, you can still seed rye after them. And this is a picture of that earthway seeder I was talking about, which is a really great little tool, even for a big home garden. I think would be a worthwhile investment. It's only about $100, and it creates a little furrow, drops seed down into the furrow at a specific rate, and then covers that over with a little drag chain, and then tamps it down with the rear wheel, all in a single pass. So it's a really neat tool for direct seeding seeds into the ground very, very quickly and efficiently. Even if I had a 10 by 20 home garden, I might invest in that, just because it makes that work so easy. So that's how we seed our cover crop. That's how we seed our cash crops as well. And we do a dozen passes or so per bed. So we're walking back and forth a lot, but it gives us a really good germination, really good stand of rye and clover. This is in the fall. And again, we irrigate it as needed. So, for anything to germinate well, it needs moisture. And then we run the turkeys over it. Back when we had turkeys, call that turkey on rye. It's a delicious combination. And then the next year, when it grows up toward the end of May, this is us stomping it down with our T-post. Two people kind of stomp in unison and knock it down. But at a home scale, you could just knock it down with your feet, just stomping on it. And then drag a tarp over it, again, to make sure that rye, those root systems are fully dead before we plant into it. So that's the tarp. We secure it well, so weight it down more than you think you need to, so the tarp doesn't blow away. And then, note how far behind those peas and oats are. Those were seeded, as early as I could, April 23rd, but they're still only, calf high by the time that the rye, it was 6 feet tall. So the rye really is a much more vigorous cover crop. It's going to feed the soil all that much more, but it's a little harder to manage too. So then we pull the tarp off of the rye, and we plant right into this as it looks just like a straw mulch now, but it was grown in place. And then we plant our transplants right through that straw, and they grow wonderfully well. And there's very, very little weeding that we did in this plot, because there's no soil disturbance, and the rye acts as a mulch that prevents the weeds. And then we when possible, if you have animals, you can run your chickens over the cover crop and add their manure, and get out into it yourself. Humans are animals too, and we add diversity to the landscape. That's part of soil health, is us getting out into, in contact with the natural landscape. If I realize cover cropping might have been a lot for a beginning home gardener. So if that felt overwhelming, don't worry about cover cropping too much. But it is really a great way to take your soil health generating capacities to the next level. But another way to do that at home is with interplanting. So planting more than one crop together is a great way to increase diversity, soil coverage, and photosynthesis all at once. Remember our principles of soil health that we see in the natural world. So this is one example. We undersow our kale to parsley, but really the sky is the limit with interplantings. You can just experiment, and there's a lot of fun in that, of what crop combinations you can put together. Combine tall ones with short ones, combine ones that like a little bit of shade under, bigger plants. Planting the shoulders of your tomato beds is a sort of no-brainer. I think home gardeners are actually much more used to interplanting than commercial farmers. So you probably all know as much as I do about this, but just that diversity that comes from interplanting is really beneficial to soil health, and also can just increase the photosynthesis. Like here, instead of having sort of empty ground between the kale plants, we have a whole crop of parsley growing up there. This is Brussels sprouts, again, planted into our grown in place rye mulch. And then we put lettuce heads in between the Brussels sprouts. And by the time the Brussels sprouts are growing up and need that extra space, that's when we're harvesting the lettuce heads anyway. So then the Brussels sprouts can fill out the bed. So finding those combinations of crops can be kind of fun and also increase your soil coverage and diversity in photosynthesis. Some more examples here. There's celery on the shoulders of tomato beds in the high tunnel. There's bok choy and salad turnips on the shoulders of the cucumber beds. Those are trellised cucumbers in the greenhouse there. We trellis them just like tomatoes, prune them to a single stem. And then we also grow ginger in a greenhouse, unheated, but it does like a greenhouse. It's a tropical crop, but we plant carrots with it, and it grows up through the carrots. So there's a delicious soup right all in one bed there. And here's some radishes in between the onions. Again, as the onions get bigger and need more space, the radishes are harvested, so they're out of the way. Carrots on the shoulders of tomato beds outdoors. Spinach on the shoulder of the sugar snap pea beds. Yeah, just anywhere there's space, try to fit in some more plants, because that's really nature's model for soil health is photosynthesizing plants everywhere. Here is sweet alyssum, is a great pollinator plant. Has lots of little tiny flowers that attract the small native insects. And the seed is very cheap too. You can just sort of sprinkle it over your crops and it will grow up through them. And it's a very low, it's not super vigorous, so it's not going to take over your garden. It has a very shallow root system, so it doesn't compete with your crops well, but it does produce those flowers that feed the beneficial insects. So it's a great crop to just sprinkle around. Here's some more sweet alyssum between tomatoes and some beets along the shoulder of the tomato bed. And then another great way to integrate diversity and just generate soil health on the farm is by planting perennials, or the farm or your garden. So perennials, unlike annuals, they stay alive year to year, so can just generate much more root mass and health in the soil than annuals. Perennials are sort of a more mature, evolved state than annuals. Annuals in nature, annual plants are generally used as like nature's band-aid for exposed or disturbed soil. And then if that soil stays undisturbed for long enough, the perennials will take over. So if we can integrate perennials into our landscape, then there's all the more diversity there. It can be beneficial insect habitat. It can keep living roots in the ground year round to keep feeding all the beneficial organisms in the soil. It can add economic diversity, since perennials are generally, not vegetables, although there are some. But yeah, it can add fruit and medicinal plants and cut flowers to your, if you're selling food. They add a lot of beauty. There's a lot of beautiful perennials out there that can bloom earlier or later than annuals can. So yeah, all these reasons we integrate, between every plot of our vegetable garden, we do a bed of, we call them a beneficial bed of different perennial flowering plants. And we stick some birdhouses in there too, just to try to really bring in a lot of diversity to the farm, because biological diversity is the foundation of ecological stability. Attracting all different kinds of insects will help control imbalances that might lead to pest problems. yeah, can help control pest infestations. It's not going to prevent all pests, but if you do get some pests, they'll have natural predators and insects that might parasitize them that help balance out those problems.
And Daniel, we did have a
Yeah.
question from my colleague Louise about perennials.
Yes.
She's asking if it's okay to dig into the soil if you're either transplanting or trying to thin them out.
Yes, of course. I'm not a purist when it comes to we try not to disturb the soil as much as possible, but if you have to plant something into it, or if you have to separate out, you do a root splitting or something, like sometimes it's just necessary to dig into the soil. But when we do that, we can then immediately, put that soil back in the hole and cover it over with mulch again, so that it's protected again. Yeah. And I mean, if you look in nature, again, looking to nature for as sort of a model of what has worked for millions of years. There is soil disturbance in nature, but it's generally either a natural disaster, which we don't really want to emulate, or it's a biological disturbance. So humans digging with their hands in the soil is a very natural thing. Just like the rodents might burrow in the soil, the earthworm burrows through the soil, the bird digs in the soil for worms. Like, I don't think we should be scared of getting our hands in the soil.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, the perennials are just, the goal is to kind of have flowering diversity throughout the year. So we're constantly having a nectar supply for beneficial insects, and just also a constant smorgasbord for our own visual joy and cutting flowers for market, or just having the farm or the garden, your yard, be a beautiful place that you want to spend time. So here are some shrub ideas, getting into sort of species. There's tall shrubs, 8 to 15 feet tall. There's elderberries, serviceberries, black haws, different viburnums, ninebark, buttonbush, hazelnuts, or any manner of dwarf fruit tree. Almost all of these are native to the Northeast, and they all have some kind of either beautiful flowers at the very least, or medicinal purpose, or produce food. So yeah, these are just great species to integrate into your landscape if you have the space. If you have less space, there's shorter shrubs that are maybe only 4 to 6 feet tall. Generally, the shrubs are about as wide as they are tall. That can be hard to plan for when you just have a tiny little sprig of a plant that you're planting. But if you're planting an elderberry, assume it's going to get 10 feet wide, because that's what it will do, even if you don't leave 10 feet for it. So yeah, short shrubs, chokeberries, honeyberries, blueberries, currants, wild raisins. It's another viburnum, I think. Summer sweet, coralberry. All these different options for different edible berries, or medicinal plants, or just pollinator plants. And yeah, there's no right thing of what you should grow. It's what brings you joy, and the more diversity, the better, in my mind. So in terms of non-shrubs, so shrubby perennials means that they stay alive above ground through the winter. So trees are woody perennials, as opposed to herbaceous perennials, where the tops die back but the roots stay alive and regrow in the spring. So rhubarb, for instance, is an herbaceous perennial. Blueberries are a woody perennial, or a shrubby perennial. So this is a list of herbaceous perennials that die back to the ground every winter, but will regrow from the roots. And I've listed them here in order of bloom time. So from early spring to late fall. I don't need to read through them all, but these are, mostly native and beautiful and medicinal, and attract all sorts of good insects, and just also bring me a lot of joy. So hopefully, yeah, you can get inspiration from that list. There's a real argument for growing native plants, just because those are the ones that have the longest relationship with the native insects, which can help sort of keep things in balance, keep the pest populations under control. That said, if you really love something that's not native, like, plant that too. There's nothing wrong with that. And then native grasses are really great for overwintering habitat for insects, for beneficial insects. Often we just think about feeding them nectar, but they also need habitat to live and to survive the winter. So planting grasses is nice too, and those are kind of ornamental grasses. They look nice as well. And then, yeah, in terms of just generating as much photosynthesis and diversity in your yard as you can, like, every nook and cranny can be planted. Generally, lawn is one of the lowest levels of soil health generation. There's not, most grasses and lawns aren't really doing a lot for the soil. They're just kind of like painting it green, essentially. So if, every nook and cranny that there's space, you can fit in some flowers and some vegetables or whatever you want to grow. And yeah, by doing that, you're not only feeding your soil, but you're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and making the planet just a little bit healthier. And then just leaving certain areas, if you have enough acreage, leaving a little bit of it to go wild, to not be managed by humans, but to just grow whatever wildflowers move in. Goldenrod and aster and all the different native wildflowers that can, be really beautiful. And so, yeah, if you have the space for it, that's a great option too. Very low labor approach. So yeah, I really believe, wrapping this up here, I believe that soil health can be measured intuitively. There's, you can get a soil test and that can tell you how healthy your soil is, but really you can sense it with your 5 senses, and just with how much you want to spend time out on that land. That can tell you how healthy your soil is. You can also taste it in the food you grow. You can sense it that way. And then you can feel it in, how you feel after you eat that food too. It's the health of the land becomes your own health. So yeah, if any of that is interesting, and or if you want to get more into the nitty gritty of the practices, this is my book that came out, I guess about a month ago. And I'd love to answer any questions.
And you have a link on your website that links to the independent bookstores.
Yes. Bookshop.org is my what I try to tell people. It's an alternative to Amazon that supports independent and local bookstores. So we still have those in the future.
And I want people to know that we also have a copy here at the library and one on the cloud library as well. For you have to get your name on them, but that's another way to access the book. So we do have a couple of questions. Pat was asking how wide the beds should be. Does it depend on what kind of what you're planting, or?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it depends mostly on sort of the ergonomics of your preference. I'd say, like, what's comfortable for you. I'm pretty tall, so my beds are wider than some people's. I think the bed top is about 42 inches and the path is 18 inches. So that adds up to, 5 feet from the center of one bed to the center of the next bed. But I think a lot of farmers prefer 4 feet from the center to center. So that would give you a 30-inch bed top. But it really, yeah, I'd say there's no right answer. It's whatever is comfortable for you. The narrower your bed is, the more of your space will be devoted to pathways. So there's, an efficiency argument of, as wide as you can, keep your beds as wide as you can. But that said, there's, the ergonomic argument goes the other way. So yeah, whatever works for you.
And Jill is asking for cover crops. What should a home gardener look for? What type of peas and oats would you buy, and where do you find the seeds?
Yeah, I order them through Johnny's. I think Johnny's sells them. Johnny's Selected Seeds. I think it's johnnyseeds.com. Or Fedco also sells them, another main cooperative seed company, fedcoseeds.com. So yeah, I just order them through them. I don't know if the local hardware store might have some, but I'm not sure they would be organic. I try to buy organic seed when possible.
Okay, we have a comment that I guess this is from Lou. It says, Frith Farm carrots are the best, sweet and tasty.
Thanks, Louise.
I guess this is maybe Louise. It's cut off here.
Yeah.
And then Maureen is asking, do you have a solution for voles that like the deep mulch?
Yeah, great question. That's often a reason why people stay away from mulches, is because rodents can move in. My solution is more cats. So, if ideally every solution to a pest problem involves increasing the life, increasing the diversity of your garden. So if you can add life to take care of a problem, that's almost always better than trying to like kill life. But in this case, yeah, the cats would be doing that for you. So yeah, cats are my solution, or they do make traps. You can trap the voles. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but I know other farmers talk about that a lot. You can maybe just do a Google search of vole traps.
And then Pat is asking, how do you keep deer or groundhogs out of the garden?
Right. Yeah. Those are tougher ones to find a biological solution because we've, the wolves are gone. But so we do have a deer fence around our garden. That's really the only thing that sort of guarantees your crops are safe. We have an 8-foot woven wire deer fence around the property. You can start with, electrified sort of psychological barriers, or the various, scented hyena urine or whatever people use. But in my experience, a physical barrier is really what it comes down to, especially in places of high deer pressure. Groundhogs, I think you kind of have to trap them, and you can do the have a heart traps if you don't want to, do away with them. But yeah, I think I haven't had any groundhogs, knock on wood. So, but I hear of other farmers trapping them and, driving them 10 miles away to a preserve or something and releasing them there.
So you mentioned weed-free compost. Are there other kinds of compost, other components that you recommend, or?
Yeah, compost can really vary in its quality. So yeah, I would say finding a good source of compost is an art, or a job. So if I would look for organic compost, because that ensures it's gone through, like I was saying, it's gone through those, it's been turned and heated up enough that it's generally weed free. But then in terms of its nutrient profile, you can generally ask for a test, profile of the nutrients in the compost if the company is selling it, or you could send it off to the University of Maine, again for $18, and get a test done on it and see what nutrients are in it. But generally, again, it comes down to sort of intuition. Like if you feel that compost and it feels sort of crumbly and soft and almost like soil, and it doesn't have much odor to it, or it smells pleasant, then that's probably good compost. It shouldn't be too chunky or slimy, or it shouldn't smell bad. That means it's not fully composted.
Okay. Does anyone else have any last minute questions for Daniel? I must say the farm looks gorgeous.
Thanks. Yeah, I
Very
hope so. I hope that
inspiring.
was wasn't too sort of commercial farming focused for everyone.
No, I think it's a lot that even on a small scale you can apply. Things I'm certainly not an experienced gardener, but certainly things I never thought to use a cover crop for. We certainly have a lot of open soil, uncovered soil in our backyard. So
Yeah, yeah, no, you know, it's it's always a work in progress.
yeah, we have a lot of comments coming in. Perfect. It was great. Louise found it very helpful. She read the book and found this presentation made everything more understandable. And Jill says, thank you. That was great and very interesting.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in.
So yeah, we encourage you to visit your website, frithfarm.net, to sign up for CSA. And it also looked like you were looking for apprentices. Is that?
Yeah, we're actually just filled up with
Oh,
our
okay.
apprentices for next season, but I haven't updated the website yet.
Okay.
But I did
Great.
want to say too that I think I was supposed to mention that in the spring we will be doing another. I think my partner Sarah might be doing it. Presentation on sort of planning the garden. We haven't set a date yet with the library, but I think, you know, stay tuned for that in the late winter or early spring.
Right. Well, thank you, Daniel, so much. Have a restful winter and a wonderful spring and great weather ahead, we hope.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.